Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Stitching Tales. I am Johanna Lundström, the author of several sewing books, including Sewing Jeans and Fit for Knits, and I also have a sewing YouTube channel, The Last Stitch.
My name is Malena Hjerpe, and I work as a freelance pattern maker, and I also create my own PDF patterns under the name Hazelhen Patterns.
And today's episode has the working title How to Sew Faster, which is probably something that we often say do not do. So maybe this is a contradictory episode, but I thought it was a fun topic to investigate, and we are both going to share some practical tips on how to actually speed up your sewing and make the workflow easier. But I think it's also going to be a little bit of a philosophical episode when we talk about the value perhaps of not always sewing fast, and in a way sometimes slowing down can be a way to actually speed up time at the end because you make less mistakes. So Malena, have you had periods where you tried to sew really fast, and what has been your experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely working against a deadline makes you work a little bit faster. But, I mean, we have mentioned this in previous episodes as well. Like, it's like the sewing machine knows when you are stressed and when you're trying to be a little bit fast. So maybe you try to remove the fabric like slightly before the machine has stopped, and then it will just create a hassle. So sewing slower might actually be faster in the long run.
Yeah, that's
probably. This is, I mean, if this is your hobby, you take the time that you want. If you want to just slow down and be very mindful about each and single step, do that. I mean, you're not in a rush. If you're working with it, then you need to monetize everything, like be as efficient as possible. But if it's your hobby, take the time and just do it in the pace that you want. But we, of course, we want to be efficient with whatever we do. Yeah. Because I don't think there's a lot of people who have like endless amount of time. So when we do things, we want to be as efficient as possible, right?
You're right. That's a very good way of rephrasing it. It's more about sewing more efficient rather than sewing faster, I think. And that, I think it all starts with the prep work, in my opinion. So at least for me, being well organized is a good starting point. I mean, these are probably obvious, but it's good. I always like to clean my desk after I finish the project, because having a clean desk gives you a good setup to not losing things. Because one common issue when you're sewing, and especially when you're sewing a little bit faster, is that it's tricky to find all your tools and your threads, and you have to switch between different needles, and all of a sudden a needle is gone. So a good way of just before you start sewing is to actually organize your workspace and figure out your preferred method of organizing. But I think that's a very good idea to start with a clean desk. Make sure what they call in the kitchen mise en place. I'm sorry I'm butchering the pronunciation, but everything has its own place, which means when in the kitchen that there's a hook for that kind of tool, and there's a stand for that, so that makes the workflow really efficient. I think that's something that we can definitely also use in our own sewing space, even when we just have a small table. For instance, one thing that I like to do is that I will post a picture of that on an Instagram account, Stitching Tales, is that I have this little metal tin, which used to be candies and bonbons, and then I just place the needles, the type of needles that I plan to use for the project, the threads, bobbins that are winded, and the right spools. Maybe I have 2 different threads. For instance, when I'm sewing jeans, I usually have to order between 2 and 3 different type of thread types. So I have all these in this can. So that means whenever I'm switching, nothing goes anywhere else than back in the can. It's not going behind the sewing machine. It's not going on the floor. It's not going anywhere else apart from back into the can.
Yeah, because that's like the most annoying waste of time, searching for things.
Yeah.
And oh my god, I mean, how many times have you searched for your scissors? Come on,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that one is just. It's
It's
disappearing every now and then.
it's so
I
crazy.
usually have like
I mean, how
I have like a small scissor that I have around my neck, basically, like the ones that you can just snip off the thread when you are sewing, cut along as you sew. That also saves a lot of time. But that one is on my neck constantly, so I always have it. The fabric scissor is a little bit more heavy, so that one, that one goes missing every now and then. I wish I was as organized as you, because I know that that is a time saver. But I'm a little bit more a messy sewer.
Yeah, and that's okay too. And we're just give you some ideas, and you can just be yourself and keep on going. I mean, eventually the garment will be finished, because you brought up a good point there in Malena, because we're not sewing for money, we are sewing for pleasure and for joy and creativity. So we don't need to maximize the time. So if something goes missing and you end up maybe you can see that as getting your steps in.
True, but keeping your tools organized, that is a great tip.
Yeah.
I mean, for life, basically.
Yeah.
And we have recommended this before, that you buy a tool belt that hairdressers use, because then you can have your fabric scissors there, you can have your measurement tape, well, which I usually have around my neck, but your seam ripper, whatever, you can have in that belt, so you always have it on you as well. If you have a luxury of having a big cutting table, you don't need to walk around all the time to get your things. You can actually just carry them around. So that could be a really efficient way of working as well.
Yeah, that's also a really good tip. And another tip, that before you start sewing and after cutting, again, just to minimize the risk for mistake, if you're doing a garment that has a lot of different pieces, and sometimes it's hard to tell which side is right or wrong. For instance, if you're sewing jersey and the jersey is dark, sometimes it's hard to see which is the wrong side and the right side, is to mark each piece. For instance, you can put a pin on the right side, or a little bit of masking tape where you put an R for the right side. So just so you do not have to flip back and forth, looking at a good lighting to figure out which is the right side. And because if you do that, as soon as you cut the piece, you mark it. And sometimes if you're doing a complicated garment with a lot of panels, for side panels and back panels, and they're quite similar on the skirt, again, mark those before you remove them from the cutting table, because that exactly which piece to go where when you're sewing later on. And that was such a game changer for me, because I've definitely been guilty on sewing jersey sleeve on the reverse because I was trying to save time and also adding a back panel to the front, because visually they were so similar that it was almost impossible to tell afterwards, and then I had to go back to the pattern piece and measure and put that on, and that just adds so much frustration. So figure out a way of marking your pattern pieces if you're doing something that you might end up being a struggle later on. Yeah,
that's a good rule or habit. I also usually, when I cut out the fabric, I maybe not cut and sew in the same go. I usually cut out 2 or 3 projects at the same time. That also, you batch cut, you batch sew a little bit more. But then I pin and cut. This is a little bit different if you are using fabric weights and rotary cutters. But I always, I don't unpin the pattern from the fabric until I actually start to sew. So then the fabric pieces and the patterns are pinned together. I mean, you can pin it afterwards if you use a rotary cutter. But then I keep track of the different fabric pieces. So much easier. And I know which one is which. I don't have to look at just and have to, a couple of days later when I actually start to sew, I have to figure out which piece was which and compare it to the patterns. Like, no, they are stuck together until I actually start to sew with that specific piece. So much easier to keep track of then. And I mean, when you are cutting out the fabric, cut the notches, do all the markings at the same time.
Yeah.
Don't do it afterwards. Like, do it in one go. It's gonna save you a lot of time, because if you remove the pattern and then afterwards want to place it on top again, it's just fiddly fabric. It's just gonna be a lot trickier to do it afterwards. So do it, mark everything out at the same time as you cut it.
Yeah, that's so true. Because sometimes we can feel a little bit, once we're done cutting, you just want to, I can't do any more today. But your future self is going to thank you if you just took that final push and also marked everything, the notches, the darts, and everything like that you need to have it. Because, yeah, it's going to be such a struggle later on to align the pieces again and make sure that the notches are on the right spot. So, yeah, so it's like a mental game. Sometimes you have to be able to have that kind of long-term thinking, even though there is a resistance, because I don't think, I mean, especially if you batch cut, it takes a while. It can be quite exhausting to cut things, especially if it's more complicated. So then you just want to, like, when you're done, you just want to push it away and forget about it. But you do bring up a really good point about the batching, because that can also save time, because then you already have everything set up. And I think it's also a brain thing, that when you do something repeatedly, you become faster and faster, because every time we have to start again, if we don't do it like on a daily basis, it's going to be a bit slower. I think that's interesting, even when it comes to cutting, that when maybe the first garment, it's a little bit slower, straighten the grain and everything like that. You're like, oh, what to do, and measuring. And then the second one, something happens with your workflow, and you notice how it becomes easy. And then on your third garment, if you have the stamina to batch cut several pieces at the same time, it's going to be so much easier. And you're also really focus and understand the process, and you also found the best way of doing things, because you have repeated them and you have that memory fresh in mind.
Yeah, and I think we need to view sewing not just as sewing. It is a little bit the same thing as painting a room, painting the walls. It actually is 75% preparing, and then it's just 25 painting or sewing. It is the same thing with sewing. It is 75 preparing for things. So the actual sewing, it's just so much more creating a garment than just the sewing. And also maybe you want to skip to iron pressing your fabric before, if it's a little bit crinkly when you cut it out. That is gonna mess up when you cut it out, because if it is crinkly, folded, and it's not gonna lay flat, and then you're gonna have more volume basically in that pattern piece when you cut it out. So make sure to press the fabric before you actually start cutting it out as well. I always do it as a habit. I always press my fabric. But I'm also a little bit obsessed with the pressing, so
yeah, you are. But you're also so right, because I'm definitely one of those can attest to what Malena was saying, because sometimes I lack the motivation, especially if it's just, and it's so interesting to see how distorted that sizing, because when for fun and giggles, when you iron that piece out and you can place the pattern piece on it, and then you see, okay, so it's grown like a centimeter or something like that, because all these small tiny crinkles, they do eat up and it shrinks kind of fabric. And when you put it out flat, and it's going to be distorted. So for instance, the arms opening might expand and become a bit too wide. All these kind of things is you minimize those when you do what Malena says, which is what we all recommend. And of course, sometimes I don't do it, but I mean, maybe especially back in the days, I definitely wasn't as doing this as much as I do now. But now I pretty much always do it, and it's the same with knit fabrics as well. Iron it out or let it hang for a bit. Not hang, but spread it out if it's been crinkled in a bowl. Yeah, spread it out on the table. Just let it sit for a bit, and so you don't have all these crinkles, because it's not gonna be a good end result.
Yeah, and I've even heard or read a recommendation that if you have a paper pattern and you have had them folded up and haven't used them for a while, that you can actually also press the actual paper pattern. I mean, low heat and no what do you say? No water, humid.
Dry. Yeah, dry.
Yeah, I mean dry.
No
irons
steam.
and things.
No steam.
Yes,
No steam. Yeah, no steam.
So just to make sure that the pattern is also completely flat, because that would also help. I mean, if it's lots of folds and on the pattern, that might also make it a lot more difficult to actually work with it. So doing these kind of things, take a longer time to prepare it, but when you actually are cutting it, it's just going to go smoother then, and then you will be faster instead. So doing the prep work, it's actually beneficial.
Yeah, very, very true. And I think that's going to be a running theme throughout this episode. And also, when it comes to cutting, I mean, having good tools is essential as well. I mean, having scissors that are sharp is going to help, because you don't want to struggle to cut through the fabric, because that again will slow down the process. I am a big fan of using a rotary cutter and a cutting mat, and that is also a way of speeding up. So if you have the space and the money, you can definitely invest in that, because that is the fastest way of cutting. Scissors are great, but if speed is something you really enjoy, which I do because I don't really love cutting, I'm very, very pleased having this setup, but it's definitely more space consuming, because you have to use this big mat as well to cut.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the scissors. I don't know, I've tried the rotary cutter, it's just not my thing. So I mean, do whatever you what you prefer. But it is this kind of step, I think. And I think do you have any good tips for, I think the most annoying and time consuming part for a home sewist might be the printing out the pattern and assembling them. Do you have any good tip for that one?
Yeah, I do actually, because I've done a video where I test the 4 most common methods.
Oh, really?
And I do have a winner. But right now I don't remember which one. But don't worry, I will link to the video.
It is a cliffhanger.
It's a cliffhanger. I think it was just folding in the extra edges and aligning it, and using stick glue was probably the fastest way, or something like that. But I will definitely link to that video if you want to see it. It's a short, snappy video. I test them all, and I think it's a really interesting experiment. So yeah.
Yeah, I think this step might be the most annoying step of all. If we can speed this one up, that would be amazing.
Yeah, it's not fun. I mean, also a way of dealing with that is just to put on something on, if you have a tablet, or if you're watching it from TV or computer, just watch something, have something, a audiobook, a podcast, maybe Stitching Tales pod. It's a good podcast, I've heard. And just to make sure that you get a little bit distracted in a way, and see it. That's a good way where multitasking can actually be helpful, I think, if just to be a bit distracting and not having to think about all the work that is, because we hear you. I mean, we sell PDF sewing patterns, and we know that some, of course, having large format printing is not accessible for anyone, and I've done my fair share of pasting together A4 papers, and it's a big thing. It's a time consuming thing.
It's a hassle. So that's the only step that I actually don't enjoy. I enjoy cutting out. I enjoy ironing the fabric. That's not a problem. Yeah, but the paper pattern, that's a hassle for me. So that I just want to go as quick and efficient as possible.
Yeah. And speaking about batching, another thing that I also recommend, just like you said with the notching, if you're using interfacing, I also recommend that you push through that exhaustion that you've probably done after you cut and notched, and also try to find that last remaining energy to also cut out the fusing or the interfacing pieces before you finish, because again, having to do that all over, starting again, putting out the pattern pieces, figuring out which goes which, and all this, because when you have it all set up, it's just so much easier to remember which pieces should be interfaced and everything like that. So do it when you have it. Your future self again is going to thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And if there are a lot of pattern pieces that are going to have interfacing, if you have fusible interfacing, you can calculate how much fabric you are going to use for that and fuse the whole fabric in one go. So much easier to just cut out already fused fabric for that then. So that might also be a little bit time saving. Yeah,
and it's also easy to get more exact because otherwise you get so much control because everything is already fused, and so sometimes you will have problems with the fusing stretching out or something like that when you add it to the pattern, the fabric pattern piece. So it's a good idea to have that as well. And there will be a little bit that you have to throw away, but you will have to do that even if you cut the fusing otherwise as well, because it's the same, the remains will still be the same basically.
Exactly.
So so we just the very very good tip, very good tip.
One thing that I really enjoy is having the pin, a pin cushion on my arm, so I never have to search for it. And when I actually am sewing, I am removing the needle as I sew. So that I can really recommend, and I really like to have it on my arm so I don't drop it on the floor and all the pins will go everywhere, and I always have it with me as I move along. So that is such a time saving thing that I never have to search for it, bring it or go back after it, and I always have them with me. So that is a huge tip.
Yeah, that's such a great tip. And if you want to see Malena's wonderful pin arm link armband, she shows it in the video version of a pod where we talk about our favorite sewing tools. I'm trying to figure out the number here, and it's probably way back in last year.
But I will really early. I think we can repost that picture on Instagram too.
That would be great.
It's really easy to do yourself. I mean, this is just a felted wool round thing that I sewn on an elastic band on. Nothing fancy at all, but it really is. It does the work.
Yes, really, really good. It was so funny. We had a good laugh when you showed it as well, because you had it for a while.
Yeah, the elastic is losing its recovery elasticity, and since I'm a sewist, do I fix it properly? No, I just pin the elastic band shorter and shorter, so I can still wear it without it, falling away. So lazy sewist here.
Yeah, and I think it's episode number 23. You can go back to our archive and check it out, and of course you can watch the video version as well, and we will also post it on our Instagram account, Stitching Tales Pod, as Malena says. Great idea. Another thing, because if you're going to go over to the sewing bit, what I like to do is to save time when it comes to overcasting or edge finishing. There are a couple of ways of, especially if you only have a sewing machine, zigzagging every single piece. It's gonna take forever, especially once you get the taste of the speed of a serger. I mean, both you and I, Malena, we are blessed to have sergers, and they make edge finishing, to prevent the edges from fraying, that makes it not that difficult. It works really fast. But if you only have a sewing machine and you have to go do that zigzag stitch, and you may be sewing a large garment, it's going to take so much time just to do that in that single step. And most sewing instructions will tell you to overcast all the edges before you start sewing, but I have some things to say about that in order to save time. First of all, now I'm going to give a general rule. There are of course exceptions, but there are a few. But a general sewing rule is that if the seams are to be enclosed, which means that, for instance, if the seams are hidden inside the waistband, for instance, or a placket, a cuff, or maybe a collar stand or a shirt, those seams are enclosed, meaning that when the garment is finished, you will not see the raw edges, whereas a non-enclosed seam could be a regular side seam on a shirt which has been finished with a zigzag stitch or a serger overlock stitch. Those are not enclosed. So usually those enclosed seam, they do not need to be overcasted, because thanks to the enclosement and sometimes also top stitching over it, for instance on a waistband or a cuff, that means that the risk of fraying in most cases, I say, of course there are exceptions with very loosely woven fabrics that can unravel, but in most cases you do not have to finish that those edges, and that can save up a lot of time, and it also reduces the amount of bulk, because if you, for instance, if you're sewing a waistband, you have zigzag stitches or serger stitches on all those extra edges, it's going to be so big if you think about it once everything is done. So you save thread as well that way, and because especially if you have to use sewing machine thread on your sewing machine, it's quite expensive to do all this zigzag stitching. Maybe you can actually skip it. The same for French seams. It's another way of not having to use edge overcasting. Do you agree with me, Malena, on that?
Yeah, no, it's totally. And I don't think they usually do it in the garment industry either.
Never.
I mean, on those specific, because it's also so small pieces. I mean, the colored waistband, like it's so enclosed that even when you wash it and the fabric is like moving, it doesn't unravel usually on these types of garments. And you can also use a zigzag scissor to cut those edges. They also fray even less. On those. And as you say, it creates bulk usually, and usually on those you also have them interfaced with the like a glued interfacing, and then that will also help it prevent from being or unraveling. So there is actually no need to zigzag those particular seams.
Yeah, I totally agree. And another way that you can also, a tip you can use from the garment industry. Now, of course, we are always taught that when we're talking about woven specifically here, is that you should press the seam allowance apart. And that makes sense in a lot of instances, but it's definitely not obligatory. And if you look inside a lot of ready-to-wear garments, you will instance, I'm wearing today blouse that I got secondhand. It's a rayon blouse, and it has it's a woven rayon blouse and has side seams. And the side seams, they have not pressed the blouse seam apart. Instead, what they've done is that they've sewn a straight seam to join the back and the front piece, and then they have overcasted both layers of the edges at the same time. So it's quite small seam allowance. I would guess about one centimeter. So we're going to post a picture of this example as well, and you can go inside pretty much any ready-to-wear garment in a regular price range. You will see that this is the most common method for instance, when you're sewing shirts or similar garments, that they do not press the seam allowance apart, because then again it saves half the time, because you just have to overcast both edges at the same time. So you can either use zigzag stitch or overlock stitch.
I actually prefer that in general. I mean, just personal opinion, because if you wear the garment and the seam would for some reason crack, then you have the overlock seam as a safety seam there, basically. So I actually prefer to not split open the. And I mean, in some cases there is a benefit for it, but in general I prefer to not split them open.
And it's the same if you're making jeans, for instance. It depends on the brand, but so there are lots of different ways of doing it, but usually the outer seams, they are often pressed apart. The seam allowance is pressed open, so there you have to overcast both sides separately. But on the inseam, it's the inseam is usually folded towards the front and then top stitched. And again, both edges are overcasted at the same time, because it would also add a lot of unnecessary bulk. You don't want that chafing. So again, it's just a very beneficial way. So for instance, if you are, of course, top stitching something later on, it's the same with the yoke, I would argue as well, there's no need to overcast both edges separately. You can just overcast it after you've sewn the seam, because you're gonna top stitch it anyway, so both edges of the will meet eventually anyway, so why spend that extra time? And so I think that's a real game changer that isn't always addressed in sewing instruction, because I understand that they want to keep it simple, this is like the standard method of doing it, but when you think about it and you realize that it's usually, you can save a lot of time doing the things that we are talking about now.
Yeah, absolutely. And keep in mind that all sewing instructions are one way of doing it. And I mean, I'm guilty for this as well. Sometimes I do things, you can do it in other ways as well. And there are so many exceptions, and in this case and that case. But your sewing instructions can't be a book. So you have to make it a little bit more neat, compromised, and contained. So the simplest way to explaining this is this way. So don't be afraid of taking, if you have learned one technique from another sewing pattern, don't be afraid to use it on this sewing pattern as well. Usually you are able to mix different techniques if you want. Yeah.
Very true. And when it comes to sewing, do you do any batching there?
Yeah, I mean, if I sew with the same thread color, I usually do those in one go, and then I'll do the neckline top stitching if I use or hemming with another machine. I usually try to think of that, but otherwise I like to sew one thing from the beginning to the end in one go, rather than sewing multiple things at the same time. So there I'm trying to not do batch sew in just for my own sake. It's I think it's more fun to finish one project before you start to sew the other one. Cutting, I have no problem of cutting lots of projects at the same time, but sewing, then I want to have one project at a time. And one thing that my teacher told me when I was 14 maybe, that I'm still it's really imprinted in my brain, is that when you have your sewing machine, serger, whatever, you should have nothing to the left on your sewing machine, so where the actual garment is gonna be. You should have no other thread spools, scissors, whatever. That area should be clean, because then it's so much easier to have your garment there and to turn it when you're sewing, and avoid things getting stuck in the machine or whatever. That's just like a general, the cleaner the sewing area is when you're actually sewing, the easier it is going to be to avoid stupid mistakes. Because we have all done that. I mean, when we sew with the serger and a layer of the fabric has been folded in and is cutting a hole in the garment, and it's just so annoying. So that is just like a little bit easier. If the area to the left on the sewing machine is nothing else but the garment that you're actually sewing, it's just easier to keep track of things.
Yeah, that's such a good tip. I love this kind of straight to the point tip, and because again, having the garment, another thing also that I struggle with, because my sewing table is a bit too small and I have 3 machines, so sometimes I have to shift them around. But obviously the lack of free space is what also causes that sometimes some of the pieces are on the floor rather than on the table, which is like, how did it happen? Because you shift everything around and then you accidentally pushes it away. So if you have some type of system or storage space close by to your sewing machine, that you can put your pieces, the one that you're supposed to be sewing and the ones that I've sewn, just so you don't have to shift through everything. Again, those way of doing it just increases the joy of sewing, I think. Then you have to, where did that small waistband piece go? I have no idea. So sometimes I like to pin them on the iron board. If I have that folded up towards the wall, I can just pin the piece on the iron board. I sometimes pin them on my dress dummy. Sometimes now I have a sofa. All things I put it on the arm rest on the sofa, just to have like a dedicated place on when you're working. That helps a lot as well.
Yeah, because losing those pieces is so annoying, and then you have
Yeah,
to
it's
search
so
for them, and it's a hassle.
Yeah, and I'm the same way as you. I do not like to batch sew garments. I like to batch do steps for a specific garment, for instance, like interfacing everything at the same time, doing top stitching, for instance, when I'm sewing jeans, I do that. So when I'm top stitching back pockets and pocket opening, I do that at the same time, so I don't have to switch thread back and forth. But just like you, I think the satisfaction of going from start to finish on a particular garment, that keeps your reward. Sewing more, yeah, because you need to get like the how do you call it, the satisfaction of finishing something that kind of sets up your hormonal system and gives more reward, like your reward system. I think that's the word I'm looking for. You have to keep that going, and to me, just like you, my reward system is much more rewarded, so to speak, when I feel like I'm actually being able to finish something, because I've done definitely batch sewing several garments at the same time, but I kind of lose the mojo, just like you say, and I feel like I've been sewing forever, and then all of a sudden everything is done, but then I feel like it's been such a slog having to do all the things, and you don't get the rewarding feeling of having finished one garment, and then you can clean your desk and then move on to the next. So because you have to think sewing should be a joyful experience, so to keep, if that's what you need to do, again, I think you should do what brings you joy. That's one of the most important thing, I think, when it comes to sewing, because again, we don't sew for money in that way.
Yeah,
so
no, and if you would, that would be completely different. If you're gonna sew 10 garments of the exact same thing, then it's much more efficient, absolutely, to batch sew and just sew that one particular seam on all the garments, or one particular step on all the garments, or whatever. But that's if you are sewing plenty of same garment, then batch sewing in that sense. Like you have a sewing line, basically, as you have in the industrial settings. But if you are just sewing one garment here and there for your own pleasure, no, it's not that. Then you should do whatever feels best for you.
Yeah. And you could also try, I guess, chain piecing in a way. Otherwise, you can... chain piecing means that you keep on sewing several pieces and you just feed them underneath the presser foot. I guess it's
thing for when you're sewing cuffs.
Yeah, that's a great... Yeah.
I sew if you have trousers, for example, you have the waistband, you have the bottom hem cuffs. Just sew them in one go and just snip the threads afterwards. So much easier. Yeah.
Because you don't have to think, you don't have to worry about securing the seams, because they're going to be enclosed inside the seams and sewed over. So unless you're really uncareful, there will be no issues with unraveling. So great tips with the cuffs. A very simple version of this is when you're serging the edges, when you're overcasting, is to just keep on feeding them and just have that thread tail running through. You don't have to stop. You just keep feeding a new piece until you have covered all the edges that you need to cover. That's just a great way. And that kind of chain piecing I actually enjoy. It kind of feels like
so efficient, like this.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so there are sometimes efficiency can actually bring out joy, even though we are a proponent of slow and mindful and methodical sewing, for sure. Sometimes it's nice to just churn out, pedal to the metal. I think it's called metal. I'm probably butchering this English saying, but something like that, and just keep on going. So those are also good tips. And there was another thing. Because as we mentioned sometimes, that usually a good way of actually sew faster is to reduce the risk for mistakes. So again, before you start sewing, once you get this flow, double check because sometimes we can get overconfidently, especially late at night, or maybe when we've been sewing for a while, and we kind of forgot to actually double check those. Is the piece on the right side? Is it the right piece pinned to the second piece? Is correct? It's just a second, and that second can make a huge difference, and especially if you're doing some seams that are hard to unrip or a very delicate fabric that risk of being ruined when you have to rip it. I mean, that double checking, it's invaluable. I mean, of course it still happens that I mess things up for sure, but I because I've changed my approach to this over the years, and I make so much less mistakes than I did way back when I had this idea that I'm just gonna it's probably gonna be fine, and just kept on sewing.
Yeah, no, that's so true. I mean, unpicking and the redoing it is just that's the worst absolute thing ever. I totally agree. And sometimes preparing can be time saving. I mean, hemming. Pre-press the hem before you start to sew, and pre-press it when you can actually have it flat on the iron table. If you are sewing a jersey top, for example, sew one side seam and then pre-press the hem flat, then sew the other side seam. It's just so much easier to press it when you are able to have the fabric flat on the table. Yeah. And always press along as you go, because pressing a finished garment is so much more difficult to do when compared to when actually pressing just that one seam straight after you sewed it before it's like enclosed in a full garment. So don't skip the pressing. It is actually more efficient to press along as you go and pre-press.
Yeah, that's great you brought that up, because I didn't think about that. It's so crucial, and that's again a good way to encourage that behavior is to set up your iron board and your iron and your pressing station before you start sewing, because then everything is set up. So you don't have to, because if you have to stop and set everything up, you might be a little bit tempted to think, maybe I'm just going to sew this seam too before I start pressing. And then you run into the issue that you explained here, Malena, is that it's going to be harder and harder to access the pieces and press them flat, because there's smaller amount of room that you have to wiggle around, and the pressing just won't be as good. I mean, that's the fact. So yeah, set definitely up everything before you start sewing. It's such a good tip for a lot of things.
Yeah, and some hems, if you have like a wide circle skirt or dress, you can, I mean, how do they do it in the garment factories? They don't press and pin those hems, for example. They have a certain like roll presser foot. They have a specific foot for the machine to be able to do that. So they basically just sew it, and the foot is gonna like fold it nicely. Yeah. So I mean, some things are like, you shouldn't do that like on a regular with a regular foot, and that's just gonna be, the end result is not going to be as pretty, and it's just going to be so time consuming. So sometimes buying these kind of specialty thing could actually be so much more helpful.
Yeah, very, very true. And sometimes these special things, they can also have a little bit of a learning curve. So I think if you do take the time of learning how to use them properly at the end, you will be able to save more time. So don't be discouraged, because I've definitely had this situation where I felt like, I'm going to just do this and it's going to be so easy. So in the beginning it might add time, but eventually when you get the handle of the tactical feel on how to do it and how to feed the fabric, you will be able to save time. So sometimes those tools are very, very helpful as well. I had another thing that I was about to say. Do you have any more tips, Malena? You can share them while I'm trying to figure out what my...
Yeah, no, it feels like most tips here is like, don't rush, take your time, it will be faster in the end.
Yeah, but we talked about a few other things as well, like batching and chain piecing and having good arrangement.
True. Yeah, no,
and
but
not overcasting the edges.
Yeah, but like the general experience, like when you are rushing, is just gonna take more time, unfortunately.
Yeah. Totally. I mean, we kind of hinted at that at the beginning of this episode as well, that we will not be able to like, oh, you're going to sew a garment now in half the time just because we give you some practical hands-on tips. That's not what this episode about. And I think all your listeners are, you know what we're talking about. I mean, we all know this. And let's just go to my final point as well about the prep work, because I'm a big fan of using hand basting as a time-saving tool. That sounds like a very
handmade things. That is
yeah, exactly.
Screams time-saving.
Exactly. What a contradiction in terms. No, but what I like to do, for instance, when there are tricky things like sewing a waistband, as we talked about in previous episodes, there's always a risk that the waistband is kind of shifting, the underneath waistband when you're stitching it in place. The inside waistband tends to shift a little bit to the front. If you baste the waistband just using regular hand basting, that issue is almost reduced to not zero, but very small. So yeah, you have to spend maybe 15 minutes basting the waistband, but you will not have to rip it up afterwards because you feel a little bit unhappy because you're a stickler for details like I am. Of course, you can do you, but for me, it's a little bit hard to deal with results that are not up to my expectations. So that's why I'm a big fan of hand basting. The same is maybe I'm trying to, say, top stitch a patch pocket on a slightly tricky fabric. Again, I prefer to hand baste the pocket to the garment pattern piece and sew it, just because I find it easier than just doing pins. So those are just things. It's the same when I sew a collar stand, for instance. When I'm top stitching that too, I also like to baste it just to that when I fold and top stitch over it, I like to baste it first rather than pins, because to me that makes it so easier to sew it right from the start. So for me, I hand baste so much. I mean, I hand baste hem on tricky knits, for instance, for the same reason, to prevent it from shifting. So yeah, I just put on some nice reality TV on my iPad, and then I crank out my hand sewing needle and thread, and I have never regretted spending those upfront 5 to 10 minutes. So yeah, hand basting can be a time-saving tool. Trust me.
Yeah, it's good. Don't rush. That's the moral of the story. And also, like, don't if you think that if something is not like vibing with your way of working, don't be afraid to like change and try some different. Ask in Facebook groups or whatever. Like, how do you have another solution for this? I mean, you don't have to use pins. You can use clips if that's working better for you. And sometimes, especially on jersey, single jersey, that the edges are like folding up. People are using glue. I never done that, but like glue that will dissolve in water. So there are different ways of doing it, and don't be afraid to try different techniques that might actually be better. I mean, if you have always cut it out, try the rotary cutter. Maybe that's a better fit for you. So don't be afraid to try other solutions and other ways of working.
Yeah, and also if you try the rotary cutter and you do not like it, like Malena, then you don't have to use it.
No, you don't.
Because, yeah.
Scissors are fine as well.
Yeah, I love that, because it's so good that we are two doing this podcast, because you definitely get different opinions on things to do it. And as we say, there's definitely not cut and dry, have to only use this specific method for something. I think, as you say, Malena, it's so good to try out things, give them a chance. Maybe something else would work better. And, that's one thing, because you always learn new methods and you try out new tools. So, yeah, I find, that's one of the things that you don't really get bored at sewing, because there's always room for development and trying out new things. So this was, perhaps you didn't get all the answers that you hoped for, dear listeners. We didn't tell you to cut your sewing time in half, but I think we gave a pretty more nuanced take on how to sew faster, and of course, again, with practice. Again, if you're new to sewing, it's gonna take a longer time, because that's just how things work. So if someone says, "Oh, I I made that top in 1 evening or in 4 hours or whatever. Yeah, maybe they did, but you don't know their story, you don't know their setup, you don't know their experience, you don't know how well it was made. You have no idea. And so do not compare yourself in that way. You have to do you and figure out a method that keeps sewing, a joy for you and also minimize the risk for mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sewing a t-shirt, I can do that really fast because I have done it so many times. I wrote instructions for how to do it. But if you are sewing a t-shirt for the first time, of course you want to, read every single step very carefully, and that will take time. So, practice makes more time efficient.
Totally. What a great final words, and thank you so much for listening. And of course, if you have any time-saving tips, please share them on our YouTube channel, Stitching Tales Pod, or our Instagram account, Stitching Tales Pod. Both these are, of course, linked in the show notes for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. I am Johanna Lundström.
And I am Malena Hjerpe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.